For the next 6 or 7 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the sexual abuse that female slaves had to endure in colonial America. In that time, the sexual abuse of slave women and young teenage slave girls was almost normal, a routine feature of life. What may have been normal to the white man caused much anguish in both the lives of the female slaves and their families. As Harriet A. Jacobs stated from her personal experience as a slave girl, "I cannot tell how much I suffered in the presence of these wrongs, nor how I am still pained by the retrospect." Even after Harriet was emancipated, the emotional and physical pain and abuse that her slave master caused stayed with her. Young slave girls received much attention from their owners as well as their owners' sons. The slave masters thought that they had a right to the female slaves' bodies as well as the sexual favors that came with them. Some men would purchase young girls simply for their own sexual gratification. Now you might be wondering, couldn't the slaves just say no? Couldn't they protect themselves from the slave masters? Well, married or not, female slaves had no way of defending themselves from the sexual and physical abuse. If they did choose to fight back and won, then they were sold to another slave master from whom they could not protect themselves. It is nice to know that sometimes the sexual advances made by a slave master could be thwarted by an emotionally and physically strong slave. Suki has a personal story of victory. Suki was her name. She used to cook for Miss Sarah Ann, but old Marsa, her slave owner, was always trying to make Suki his gal. One day, Suki was in the kitchen making soap when old Marsa came in to get after her about something. He lay into her, meaning he beat her, but she ain't answer him a word. Then he tells Suki to take off her dress. She told him no. Then he grabbed her and pulled it down off on her shoulders. When he done that, he forgot about whooping her, 'cause he grabbed hold of her and tried to pull her down on the floor. Then that black gal got mad. She took and punched old Marsa and make him break loose, and then she gave him a shove and pushed his hind parts down in the hot pot of soap. Soap was near to boiling, and it burnt him near to death. He got up holding his hind parts and ran from the kitchen, not daring to yell, because he didn't want Miss Sarah Ann to know about it. The story goes on to say that Suki was sold again, but that old Marsa never did bother slave gals no more. I say good for her. Because of Suki's courage and strength, she was able to ward off her attacker, not only from herself, but also from future girls whom he may have attacked in the future. Although Suki came out on top and defeated her attacker, other female slaves, well, they didn't always win. Female slaves were raped or coerced into having sex with their masters. Because of this, many young slave girls chose to get married at ages of 14 and 15, merely trying not to be vulnerable to the sexual propositions of their slave masters. Now, I'm 16, only a couple years older than the slave girls, and the biggest things I have to worry about right now is how much homework I have or whether or not I'm going to hang out with friends this weekend. The slave girls, they had to worry about who they were going to marry in order to prevent being raped. No slave woman or girl was safe from any kind of unwanted sexual advances. Just imagine girls, younger than almost the entire sophomore grade, trying to protect themselves from such advances at such a young age. Them, their families, their friends, their community, everyone living in constant concern and fear of the white slave master forcing himself upon the enslaved woman. If the slave girls refused the advances made by the slave owners, then they were beaten or starved until they succumbed to the slave master's will. I know I can't even wrap my mind around that. You might also be wondering, what happened to the mulatto children born of a slave and her master? The sexual abuse that female slaves underwent not only negatively affected the women's lives, but also the lives of the mulatto children. The slave owners could be very loving of their mulatto children, such as in the case of Omar's John, who treated the child born with his slave just as he did the child born with his very own wife. John was very loving of his child, of his mulatto child, but other fathers could be very brutal and mean and abusive of their mulatto children. One young slave boy was punished greatly for his being born of a white man and a black slave, something that he couldn't even help. Here is his story. Before my father gave me to his sister, he willed I must wear a belt till I was 21-year-old, strapped around my shoulders with the belt about 3 feet from my head in a steel frame. I was tied and strapped to a tree and whipped like a beast by my father till I was unconscious, and then left strapped to the tree all night in cold and rainy weather. My father was very mean. That was for punishment for being born into the world a son of a white man and my mammy, a Negro slave. Think about how much your parents love you. Yes, there may be fights and small arguments at times, but eventually everything works out. I remember I was about 7 years old, maybe 8, and I went into the kitchen to get a snack, and the news was on, and there was an investigation about a young kidnapped girl and her abduction and how the police and her parents were looking for her. And I remember this day very distinctly, and I remember my mom sat me down in a chair and she explained to me, and she said to me, "Sophie, if anybody ever takes you or tells you that your dad and I don't love you anymore or don't support you or have stopped looking for you, that they're wrong." She told me that she and my dad would never ever give up on me or stop looking for me. I know my parents would lay down everything in the entire world to make sure that I was safe and healthy and secure and that I felt supported and loved. But unfortunately, the mulatto children couldn't say the same about their very own fathers. Their fathers were cruel and brutal and chose to whip their mulatto children, both physically and emotionally. The children born of forced sexual relations didn't get to feel the love and support that a parent can offer their child. Instead, their lives were negatively affected, and they were always wary and fearful of their fathers, a person who, at least in my life, represents security, safety, and love. With sexual abuse being constantly present in colonial America, do you think it exists today? Put yourself in the slave woman's shoes and let me ask you one more question. How would you have handled the sexual abuse female slaves had to endure and fear for their entire lives?
Today I'm going to talk to you about an issue that will surprise most people living in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. Sex trafficking. Yes, Portland is surrounded by the beautiful Cascade Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. It is actually one of the nation's most livable cities. However, most people don't know that Portland is also dubbed as Pornland. When I was younger, my family and I would always go to the Lloyd Center. We would always go to the top floor where the food court was, and I would eat hot dog on a stick while my parents got Oriental Express. Then we'd find a table around the platform that overlooked the ice skating rink. Afterwards, my sister and I would chase each other down the hallways of Apollo Community College. And finally, my sister and my parents would wait outside Scamp's pet stores as I walked through the narrow aisles. I would look carefully at each puppy in those 2x2 cages. I would notice, though, that all these dogs were always pressed up sleeping against the back of the cage. Only until when Scamp's pet stores closed did I find out that these dogs were born sick, kept sick, and sold sick. Believe it or not, teenage girls in Portland and all around the nation are walking into situations just as bad as these dogs. The typical 3-step process of how a girl gets trapped into this vicious system. A girl gets attention from a guy who offers her luxuries. Then this guy earns the trust of the girl and then manipulates it in order for her to work for him. Then this girl goes from being devoted to this man to being so afraid of him that she is not willing to run away. This is not really kidnapping. Unlike what happened in the colonial times, girls are walking into these traps. In fact, any girl is vulnerable for this situation. Girls just like us who want attention, emotionally insecure girls, and especially homeless girls. In fact, 1/3 of teenage girls who become homeless are picked up by pimps within the first 48 hours of homelessness. This is a really big number considering that Portland has one of the largest homeless populations. So why Portland? Well, Portland has a huge commercial sex industry. There are more strip clubs and massage parlors per capita than Las Vegas. Las Vegas. Just take a stroll down Northeast 82nd Avenue. It's also dubbed the Track. You will see over 100 strip clubs and massage parlors. In fact, girls get dropped off there every night to complete their jobs. Also, Interstate 5, which runs from California up to Washington, is a really popular place for pimps to travel with their sex slaves. Portland, unfortunately, lies right in the middle of this highway. Welcome to the nation's most livable cities, everyone. In fact, last week, my pastor at church talked about an experience he had in Gresham, Oregon. He and his wife were stopped at a stoplight when he observed a man yanking a teenage girl's hair at the bus stop. Infuriated, my pastor pulled over to the curb and ran over to the girl. My pastor told us that the girl actually started to defend the man who had just abused her and told my pastor that everything was fine and that he should leave them alone. This is a common reaction among sex slaves when they are confronted by policemen or officials. They pretend like nothing has happened and that everything is okay. This is because their pimps threatened them. You see, these pimps abuse these girls emotionally and physically. They demand each girl earns a minimum of around $2,000 each night, and surprisingly, these girls don't get a penny. Emotionally, these pimps threaten to kill a sex slave's family and loved ones if they try to rebel or run away from their pimp. And physically, these pimps, on top of what the sex slaves have to do at night, these pimps force their sex slaves to do sexual favors for them and their friends. And they don't feed the girls much, and in fact, they hide them away so that the policemen won't catch them. But to bring the physical and emotional abuse to another level, these pimps use the same tactics that the Nazis used in World War II. Jews in the concentration camps were given numbers that were tattooed on their forearms as a way to label and degrade them as humans. Well, these pimps are actually tattooing their sex slaves with their personal insignias so that other people will know who these slaves belong to, and it's a personal reminder for the slaves that they will always and permanently be owned. Sophie mentioned mulatto children of the colonial era. Well, girls who become pregnant by their clients give birth to children who will never know who their dad is. These children grow up thinking that this type of lifestyle is normal and acceptable. And most times, these children walk in the same footsteps as their mothers. But in most situations, pimps force their sex slaves to get abortions, and oftentimes, because they're afraid to be caught if they go to the hospital, these pimps perform the operations themselves. Just a few days ago, many people became aware of who Joseph Kony was. He kidnaps young girls and boys from African villages and forces the boys to become child soldiers, and then he forces these girls, who are ages from 7 to 12, to become sex slaves. We're talking tens of thousands of girls. People have sacrificed their lives in this nation for us to get rid of slavery. However, hundreds of thousands of girls are still working for these pimps worldwide. Living in Portland, although it is one of the nation's most livable cities, yet it has the nation's most biggest sex trafficking business, living in Portland, we cannot turn a blind eye to this dire situation at hand. Although it's really difficult to help these girls get out of this vicious system of sex trafficking, what we can do is just to be aware and to be educated that slavery is in fact far from over.